HOA Karen blocked my creek, so I let nature drown their luxury neighborhood. She stood there, on dry ground, pointing at the water swallowing her house, her voice shaking, her perfect lipstick ruined, her $5 million dream sinking. But the crazy part, I didn't touch her property, I didn't touch the water, I didn't move a single rock, I just followed her rules. Perfectly. And now, the entire HOA is underwater. Who do you think they blamed? Me, or the storm? Welcome to HOA Nightmares. I'm just a regular guy living in a quiet American suburb. I work a basic 9 to 5. I keep my lawn clean, I mind my business, until the HOA stopped minding theirs. If you hate power-hungry HOAs, if you love seeing Karens get reality checks, then hit subscribe right now and comment. Boo HOA if you've ever dealt with one. Also, share this with someone who hates HOAs as much as you do. And now, let me tell you what really happened. I never thought a small creek behind my house would turn into a full-blown war zone. Back when I bought this place, the realtor called it a feature. A natural drainage creek. Great for property value, he said with a fake smile. But guess what? The HOA saw it as a problem, not a feature. Because luxury neighborhoods don't like ugly things. Even if those ugly things protect them, the creek had always been there, quiet, flowing, minding its business, like I tried to do every single day, but Karen didn't like it. Her house was built uphill, right behind mine. Big glass windows, white stone walls, perfect Instagram life, and perfect ego. She came over one morning, coffee in hand, sunglasses bigger than her personality. She didn't knock. She just walked in my yard and said, "This little ditch is ruining our neighborhood aesthetic." I almost laughed. I told her it was a natural creek, city drainage, couldn't be touched by law. She smiled, the kind of smile people use before lawsuits, and walked away. 2 weeks later, I got my first HOA letter. Your property contains an unapproved water channel. Fill or modify immediately. I thought it was a joke, but they weren't joking. They fined me $250, then $500, then $1,000. All because I refused to dump concrete into a natural water path. I went to the HOA meeting, full of people who pretend to care. Their office smelled like expensive perfume and fake authority. Karen was the president. Of course she was. She leaned forward, her nails tapping on the table, and said, "You will comply, or we will take legal action." I could see it in her eyes. She didn't care about rules, she cared about control. I tried fighting it legally, but lawyers cost more than my car. So I kept ignoring their letters. Until one morning, I woke up and heard machines. Heavy machines. I ran outside. And there it was. Construction trucks, concrete mixers, workers. On my creek. I screamed at told them to stop. They didn't. They showed me a paper with HOA letterhead, approved by Karen. They were literally sealing the creek, turning it into a concrete scar. I felt sick, but I stayed calm, because in my head, something clicked. I didn't argue. I didn't threaten. I didn't boast. I just smiled and said, "Okay, let them do it." Because sometimes, the best revenge is letting stupid people finish their own mistake. That summer, Texas skies turned angry. Dark clouds started stacking, like unpaid bills. The rainy season came earlier, heavier, and I started keeping track. Every weather report, every storm warning, every inch of rainfall. And Karen, she just kept walking around, like she owned the sky too. Until one night, the thunder didn't stop, and the rain didn't care. Who signed HOA letters? By the next morning, the creek had nowhere to go, because she killed it. The water started rising. Slow. Quiet. Like karma walking in heels. And that's when her phone started ringing. Do you think I warned her about what was coming? Or do you think I stayed silent, just like she did, when she drowned my property rights? What would you have done? Comment below.
So as we ease our way out of the swirling smoke-filled tents of ancient Central Asia, let's drift somewhere else, somewhere quieter, dimmer, and frankly, a little more confused about what plants are actually supposed to do. Somewhere where everything is damp for no reason, where people believed wearing a garlic necklace counted as medical innovation, and where the average life expectancy seemed personally offended by the concept of longevity. Let's drift into medieval Europe. And remember, we're not speeding there. We're floating. Softly, like a tiny herb leaf carried by a vaguely cooperative breeze. No rush. You're probably settling deeper into whatever blanket or pillow you've claimed for the evening, and honestly, that is the correct posture for medieval history, because the Middle Ages were slow and sleepy, and filled with people trying their best with only 3 scientific facts and a dream. By the time cannabis reached medieval Europeans, it had settled into a rather unglamorous role. It wasn't divine. It wasn't spiritual. It wasn't used for Scythian-style sauna parties. Europeans mostly looked at the hemp plant and went, well, we can make rope out of that. And then they did that, repeatedly, enthusiastically, almost aggressively at times. Hemp ropes held ships together. Hemp fibers became clothing. Hemp seeds were fed to livestock. Nearly every household had some form of hemp product, which meant medieval Europe was technically filled with weed. They just weren't using it in the way any modern viewer of this video might imagine. To be fair, medieval people had bigger concerns, like famine and plagues, and the fact that bathing was treated like a hobby rather than a hygiene practice. If you have only 2 sets of clothes for your entire life, and one of them is made from hemp, you're not exactly experimenting with recreational plant smoke in your free time. But there were healers, midwives, and herbalists who knew the plant's medicinal side. Quietly, discreetly, because medieval medical knowledge was heavily policed by men who often confused, "I don't understand this," with, "it must be sorcery." Herbalists used cannabis to soothe pain, calm inflammation, and help those suffering from stiff joints, which, in a world where people carried buckets of water for a living, was basically everyone over the age of 25. Hemp oil was used for poultices. Crushed cannabis seeds were added to brews, but the idea of lighting it on fire to relax? Very rare. Not because they were morally opposed, they just didn't think of it. Medieval Europe was impressively uncreative about some things. They had churches decorated with gold leaf and soaring spires, but when it came to herbs, they mostly said, "Maybe this helps with headaches? Let's rub it on something and hope for the best." Still, every now and then, a physician would write a note about it, usually in Latin, and always with a tone suggesting that they felt very clever for rediscovering something Asia had figured out thousands of years earlier. We'll drift gently past them and move toward one of my favorite historical transitions, the moment when Europeans finally started getting curious about things again. The Renaissance. When suddenly, after hundreds of years of quietly surviving, Europeans collectively looked around and said, "You know what? Maybe we should read some books. Maybe we should examine some plants. Maybe we should stop basing medical knowledge solely on whether Mars is in retrograde." This is when cannabis started getting attention again. Botanists, who were basically plant enthusiasts with fancy hats, began drawing the plant in their herbals. They described its uses, its properties, and in one case, its warming and moist nature, which sounds like they were reviewing a loaf of bread rather than a useful plant. And while Europe was rediscovering cannabis as medicine, the rest of the world continued its relationship with the plant in more interesting ways. In India, bhang remained a beloved companion at festivals, offered to deities and consumed by devotees who likely experienced the divine in ways that can only be described as pleasantly floaty. In parts of the Middle East, hashish quietly persisted despite occasional moral panics. And in Africa, various cultures adopted cannabis into their traditions, using it for both ritual and relaxation. Humans everywhere seemed to agree on one essential point. The plant was helpful, comforting, predictable even, which is more than can be said for many aspects of pre-modern life. Let's drift soft.
By the next morning, the water didn't just stay. It spread, not fast, not slow, but steady, like it wanted to make a point. I stood by my window, watching boats replace cars, watching silence replace fake suburban noise. And the weird part, the sky was calm again, like the storm came, did its job, and left. But what it left behind was war, not rain, not mud, not broken fences, just people. Angry people. And angry people are worse than floods. The HOA board called an emergency meeting. Even though their own office was half underwater, they booked a hotel ballroom with white sheets, fake plants, and cheap lighting. Because nothing screams power, like pretending nothing happened. I went. Not because I cared, but because I wanted to listen. I walked in, and the room went quiet. Not respect, not fear, just awareness. The man whose truck floated past his house, the woman who lost her backyard, the old couple whose basement turned into a lake, all staring at me like I was the warning sign they ignored. Karen sat at the head table, still trying to look in charge, even with damp hair and tired makeup. Her voice was softer now, but not apologetic, just political. We are here to discuss solutions. Solutions, like they were selling towels, not covering disasters. Someone from the back yelled, "You wanted that creek gone." Another one shouted, "I told you it was drainage." She tried to talk over them, but nobody let her, because when people lose money, they get loud. She finally pointed at me and said, "He should have fought it harder." The room went dead, all eyes on me, and I felt it, that moment, where you either become silent or become the enemy. So I stood up, no shaking, no fear, just calm. I held up my file, every letter, every fine, every violation notice, every demand signed by her hand, and I spoke slow. "So you ignored the city engineers, ignored environmental warnings, ignored basic water flow, but odd. Now I should have been more responsible." You could hear breathing again. She opened her mouth, but nothing came out, because truth is heavier than HOA authority. A city inspector walked in right then, soaked boots, clipboard, no smile. He didn't care about rank or Karen energy or board titles. He only cared about one thing: cause and damage. He asked simple questions. Who authorized construction? Who approved concrete? Who bypassed environmental checks? And she tried to say, it was a board decision. But the room went quiet again, because they all knew. It was her. She signed. She pushed. She forced. She threatened. He wrote everything down, slow, like he was enjoying it. When he left, he didn't say much, just one line. "This is going to get expensive." And that is when the room really lost control. People started yelling about insurance, about lawsuits, about fines, about suing her personally. Some wanted the board dissolved, some wanted her removed, some wanted her house demolished. And she just sat there, small now, not powerful, not elegant, not untouchable, just another homeowner with a big mistake. But that wasn't even the real problem yet. 2 days later, I got served papers, not from her, from 3 homeowners. They were suing everyone, the board, the HOA, the construction company, even me. Because apparently when something goes wrong, everyone looks for someone to blame, and some people blame. The closest surviving house. I stood in my driveway, holding the envelope, watching rescue crews, watching news trucks, and thinking, this isn't over. It's just changing shape. The media started calling me, not for facts, for drama. Do you feel guilty? Did you warn them? Was this revenge? I answered exactly how I should. I just followed HOA rules. That sentence, it spread like wildfire. They put it on screens, on captions, on articles, and people everywhere started using it as a joke, as a meme. He has a warning, and she hated it. I could see it. Every time we crossed paths, that sentence hurt her more than the water, because she built her life on rules she didn't expect to suffer from.
Let's float somewhere gentler now, into the private lives of ordinary people in the early 1900s. While governments debated, while newspapers dramatized, a quiet truth remained. Cannabis was still used by everyday people who weren't looking for rebellion, crime, or chaos. They just wanted relief, something for pain, for insomnia, for anxiety, for the quiet, unspoken burdens life placed on them. And here, in these private moments, the quiet nighttime smoke, the shared laughter among friends, the patient sipping of tea laced with the plant, you see the continuity that stretches across millennia. Humans, no matter the era, use what the earth offers to soften the edges of existence. But let's drift onward again, into the mid-20th century, where cultural shifts became louder, stranger, and more contradictory. The 1960s, for example, saw cannabis burst back into popularity, not as medicine, not as ritual, but as a symbol of counterculture. A plant that had once accompanied nomads on the Asian steppes was now caught between rock music, protest movements, and the lingering anxiety of governments that still
I didn't answer her that night. I just looked at her, watched the water ripple behind her like it was listening too. She waited, like the answer was a life jacket, and silence was the tide pulling her under. Finally, she lowered her head and walked away. No screaming, no threats, no rules, just footsteps, wet, slow, defeated. And that's when I realized power never leaves loudly. It just leaks out, little by little, like water through cracked concrete. The next morning, the news vans came back. Bigger ones, more cameras, more questions. They weren't even looking at the neighborhood anymore. They were looking at her house, perched on the one dry corner, like a castle on a melting hill. She tried to avoid them, closed blinds, locked gates, canceled her doorbell camera. But you can't block a story. Once the world smells it, people wanted a villain, and HOA presidents make perfect villains. The lawsuits multiplied, 7, then 10, then more. People she once fined, people she once threatened, people she once ignored, all suddenly remembered her name and wrote it down legally. The board turned on her, the same board that nodded to her every word, that laughed at her jokes, that signed her nonsense. Now suddenly, she acted alone. We didn't know. She pushed us. Funny how courage only shows up when blame does too. They held another meeting, but this time she wasn't at the head table. She wasn't at any table. She was just a chair against the wall, and nobody wanted to sit next to her. They discussed removing her, not emotionally, not personally, just like removing mold, because once something poisons the structure, you pretend it was never home. I stood there, watching it happen, watching power taste its own medicine, and I thought, this is it. This is where I walk away. Let the current handle the rest, but life never lets you leave clean. 2 days later, I got another knock. Not her, Aloy. Gray suit. Tired eyes, smelled like coffee and stress. He asked me to testify, not against her, for her, because apparently the construction company was fighting hard, trying to pin everything on her, saying she forged signatures, pressured officials, manipulated approvals, and they wanted me to decide her fate. Again, I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. Power never drowns alone. It drags everyone. For air, he gave me papers, left his card and said, "You can change everything with a statement." And that sentence stayed in my head, like damp walls, refusing to dry. Change everything. For who? For her. For them. For me. For the creek. For the water. For the people. For the narrative. The neighborhood slowly drained. The water moved back to wherever it came from, but the damage stayed. Cracked roads, warped fences, ruined basements, stained living rooms, and a memory that wouldn't fade. The same people who blamed me now waved when they saw me. Not because they liked me, because survivors recognize survivors. Karen barely came out. When she did, she walked fast, head down, like someone always filming her, even when nobody was. One evening, I saw her by the creek. What was left of it? It wasn't beautiful anymore. Just a shallow reminder of what happens when arrogance meets nature. She didn't look at me, she just spoke. I used to think control meant safety. Her voice wasn't sharp, it wasn't fake, just broken, and I didn't interrupt, because broken people finally tell the truth. She continued. I thought if I controlled everything, nothing could get out of hand. I watched the water, barely moving now, and said, "And look what happened when you tried." She nodded, slow like accepting weather. "They're taking my house." That line didn't come with tears, just information, like reporting the temperature. They say it's to cover the damages. I didn't feel joy, and I saw tears. Didn't feel pity, just a quiet understanding that life collects what arrogance spends. She finally looked at me and asked again, "Will you speak for me? Not as a victim, not as a president."
There are written accounts of people lying on the floor of heated rooms, staring at the ceiling mosaics, counting tiny tiles as if they were sheep. Warmth, stillness, and tile counting. This was ancient Rome's version of a sleep aid. The ancient Roman love of silly pets. We imagine Romans with lions and exotic animals, and yes, some wealthy Romans collected strange creatures, but many also kept small, gentle, and incredibly boring pets. Snails, for example. Yes, snails. Some Romans raised luxury snails in stone enclosures called cochlearia. They fed them special diets to enlarge them, mostly for eating, but some people kept them because, in a very slow-moving way, snails were soothing to watch. Watching a snail go from one leaf to another could genuinely take long enough to be considered a leisure activity. Then there were dormice, tiny, fluffy creatures kept in pots called gliraria. They were coddled, fed carefully, and treated with a tenderness that seems surprising from people known for gladiator battles. Owning a plump dormouse was not just a status symbol. It was a lifestyle, a calm, quiet one, the most uneventful banquets in history. Roman banquets were grand, but they were not fast. They were long, slow, drawn-out affairs where people spent more time reclining on couches than eating. A typical banquet lasted several hours. Not because there was so much to eat, but because the Romans preferred to linger over every stage. The opening appetizers, the mild chatter, the long pause before the wine, the equally long pause before dessert, the even longer pause after dessert where nobody wanted to get up. The actual course of the meal wasn't important. The slowness was the luxury. You weren't supposed to be in a hurry. Time was a sort of soft cushion everyone rested on. Conversation topics at Roman banquets were not exciting. Writers from the period even joke about the boredom. Lengthy discussions of weather patterns, updates on someone's fig trees, minor temple restorations, who had recently purchased new sandals, arguments about slightly different types of olive oil. Imagine an entire empire concerned with olive oil varieties and arguing about them with passion. The Romans didn't mind long silences either. They considered silence a part of the social experience. A room full of wealthy Romans reclining in perfect stillness, listening to the crackling of lamps, sipping wine very slowly. It almost sounds like a relaxation exercise today. The Roman passion for minor collections. While some Romans collected marble statues or elaborate mosaics, many had hobbies so quiet they barely counted as activity.
Time didn't erase it. It reshaped it, like water does, when it passes through places. That thought they were stronger. The headlines faded, the reporters left, the cameras moved on, to other disasters, other villains, other stories with louder flames. But our neighborhood stayed quiet, not peaceful, just careful. Like a place that learned pain has a memory. New people started moving in, families who never saw. The water rise, who never smelled that thick brown silence. They just saw the cheap houses, the new fences, the rebuilt streets. They didn't see what wasn't rebuilt, and that was the problem. Because history doesn't repeat loudly. It comes back, soft, friendly, disguised as normal. One day, a letter came. Not from a lawyer, not from a reporter, not even from the HOA, from the city. They wanted to build a new community enhancement project. Walking trails, decorative bridges, a cafe near the creek, they called it, restoration. I called it a repeat with better marketing. And the worst part, people started liking the idea. They liked the drawings, the clean renderings, the green promises. They forgot why the creek stayed protected. They forgot why it was left alone. They forgot why the soil there had scars. So they asked me to attend another meeting, not as complainant, not as victim, not as enemy, as experience, and I didn't want to go because scars don't like being reopened. But ignorance is louder than trauma, and someone had to speak. The hall was different this time. No Karen, no old board, no ego throne, just young planners, smooth presentations, bright smiles, and a crowd full of short memories. The presenter spoke about beauty, about increasing property value, about making the area more attractive, and people clapped, because dreams always clap louder than warnings. Then they asked me to talk. I stepped up and saw it, the same look, the same one the old board had, not arrogance, Jew. Sane convenience, so I said. You're not designing a park, you're testing a wound. Silence, because nobody likes metaphors. When they hit too close, I told them about the engineers, the warnings, the water. I told them how nature doesn't need permission to remind you where it belongs. Some listened, some nodded, some checked their phones, because destruction is boring. Once it stops trending, the city thanked me, smiled, promised careful planning, and still moved forward, just slower. The construction began, not over the creek, but around it, a little closer, then comfort, a little further, then danger, or so they believed. And I watched the soil again, I watched the machines again, I watched the confidence again. Because confidence is the most dangerous flood. People stop seeing limits when they smell progress. Months passed, then a full year, no storms, no warnings, no drama. Just normal, the most dangerous kind. Then one night, it rained. Not a storm, not a disaster, just rain. But the ground hadn't healed. The old pathways still remembered, the routes, the flow, the weakness. And slowly, very slowly, the water came back. Not like before, not angry, not violent, just enough. Enough to block roads, enough to fill basements, enough to whisper, I'm still here. And this time, no one could point fingers, because there was no Karen, no villain, no easy face, just collective forgetfulness. The city paused everything, pulled the machines back, canceled the cafe, removed the bridges, because they finally understood you can't decorate a warning and call it beauty. People got angry again, but quieter, more embarrassed than furious, because this time they knew the fault was shared. A few nights later, I got a message from an unknown number. It just said, "You were right." I didn't ask who it was, because I already knew. People only text you that when they lose their argument to reality. I didn't reply, not out of pride, but because being right was never the goal. Being heard was. And that part still wasn't finished. A group of residents started a community committee, not an HOA.
As the candle shrank, the flame flickered slower, and the light dimmed. It felt like a countdown to sleep. You didn't rush. You didn't fight it. You let the darkness come to you. Many medieval people fell asleep watching the candle fade, as if the night itself were tucking them in. The quiet, early hours of second sleep. After the wakeful hour or two came second sleep, a deeper, easier rest that carried people into dawn. Animals stirred outside. Roosters crowed early. Soft morning light filtered through shutters. People rose slowly, not with the sharp alarm we know today. They stretched, folded blankets, and stirred the ashes of the fire to bring back warmth. The day began not with noise, but with calm. The slow beauty of medieval sleep. When you step back and look at it, medieval sleep wasn't strange. It was peaceful. It followed the rhythm of nature. It flowed with darkness and dawn. It embraced waking as part of resting. It celebrated stillness. It respected the softness of night. And perhaps if you're listening now with heavy eyes and slow breathing, you're closer to that medieval rhythm than you think.
The courtroom fell silent. Even the air felt heavy, like it was holding its breath along with everyone else. The judge's gavel hadn't even fallen yet, but everyone in that room knew something big was coming. Sarah sat frozen in her chair, her fingers gripping the edge of the bench so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Her heart felt like it was slamming against her ribs, trying to escape. Jason, standing beside her, placed a hand gently on her shoulder. "You did the right thing," he whispered. But Sarah wasn't sure if anything still felt right anymore, because standing across the courtroom was Linda and Mark, her parents, and their eyes weren't full of love anymore. They were full of desperation. The mask finally slips. The judge leaned forward. "Mrs. Linda Harper, Mr. Mark Harper, due to overwhelming evidence provided by recorded conversations, written threats, financial documents, and witness testimonies, this court has found you guilty of fraud, emotional manipulation, and attempted control over an adult dependent under false medical claims." Gasps spread around the courtroom. Tears flooded Linda's eyes instantly. "No, no, this is wrong," she cried. "We're her parents. We raised her. We sacrificed everything." Mark tried to hold her hand, but his face had gone pale and stiff. The judge raised a hand. "Love is not ownership," he said firmly, "and parenting does not give you the right to control another human being's entire life." Sarah swallowed hard. Her breathing was shallow now. She wasn't celebrating. This didn't feel like victory. It felt like a funeral for the family she once thought she had. The sentence. After a long pause, the judge finally spoke again. "For your actions, this court orders, Mrs. Linda Harper will serve 18 months in a correctional facility. Mr. Mark Harper will serve 12 months for his role and financial cooperation. And, furthermore, all legal authority over Sarah Harper's personal or financial decisions is permanently revoked." A sharp sound escaped Linda's mouth. Not a scream, not a cry. Something broken. Mark simply stared at the floor. The guards stepped forward. And just like that, they were no longer her controllers. They were just two people who had ruined their own lives. Outside the courthouse, cameras flickered and reporters swarmed closer. "Sarah, how do you feel? Do you forgive them? Was this all planned with your fiancé?" She froze. Jason stepped forward. "No more questions," he said firmly. But Sarah raised her hand. "It's okay." The reporters quieted. She took a deep breath. "They were my parents," she began softly. "And part of me will always love them, because they gave me life. But love doesn't mean letting someone destroy you. This isn't about revenge. This is about choosing to live." The cameras kept flashing. But for the first time, Sarah didn't feel like she was trapped in their light. She felt like she was walking out of a tunnel. That night. Back home, the house felt different, lighter, quieter, like a storm had finally moved on. They sat on the couch, not even turning on the TV. Just silence. Not the painful kind. The peaceful kind. Jason looked at her. "You're really free now." Sarah didn't answer immediately. Her eyes stared at the floor. "I should feel happy," she whispered. "But instead I feel empty." Jason nodded slowly. "That's normal," he said. "You didn't just lose control. You lost a version of your family, too." A tear rolled down her cheek. "I never had real parents," she murmured. "I just had owners." Jason pulled her into a hug. "And now," he whispered, "you have a future." 2 weeks later, a letter arrived. Sarah recognized the handwriting immediately. Linda. Her hands trembled as she opened it. Inside were pages of apologies, of claims, of regret. "I did it because I was scared of losing you, because I didn't know how to let you go." Sarah stared at the words. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She folded the letter carefully and placed it in a box. Some things don't deserve answers, just acceptance and distance. Building a new life. Months passed. The house transformed. She started decorating it the way she wanted. Bright colors, music playing in the mornings, plants by the window. No schedules, no medications forced on her, no check-ins, just life. Jason supported her every step, not as a controller, not as a savior, but as someone walking beside her. She enrolled in therapy, started painting again, smiled more, and little by little, the girl her parents had buried begun to breathe again. A final visit. One day, she received a message. Mark wanted to see her before his release. She thought for a long time, then decided yes. Not for him, but for herself. When she walked into the visiting room, he looked older, smaller, defeated. "I don't expect forgiveness," he said quietly. "I just want to know, are you okay?" Sarah studied him. Not with anger, not with hate, but with distance. "I'm finally living," she said. "And that's something you never wanted me to do." His eyes filled with tears, but Sarah stood up and walked away, without carrying his guilt. Closing scene. That night, she stood on her balcony, the city lights glowing below, the wind brushing her face, and for the first time, she didn't feel like a daughter, a victim, or a controlled project. She just felt like Sarah, a woman, a survivor. And this time, the future wasn't a cage, it was wide open. She stood there, on my porch, in the same spot she once pointed at me like a criminal, now. Her hands were shaking, not from cold, from reality, the concrete river behind her, still half flooded, still muddy, still loud, every sound from it felt like a reminder of her mistake. Her nails were bitten, her eyes sunken, her voice not sharp anymore, just tired. "Please, testify that I didn't mean this." The words felt heavy, like wet clothes on a body. I didn't invite her in, didn't shut the door. I just leaned on the frame and let the silence do the thinking. "I never meant to hurt anyone," she said, her lips barely moving. "I just wanted order." I almost laughed, but no sound came out. "Order?" I asked. "You buried a creek under concrete because it didn't match your aesthetic." She flinched, like the truth slapped her. "And now your order is floating in people's living rooms." Her mouth trembled. "You think I wanted this ending?" she whispered. "No," I said. "I think you just never imagined one." The air got quiet again, not awkward, just real. And real makes people uncomfortable. She looked down at her shoes, the ones she used to wear when she walked around issuing fines. Now they were muddy, cracked, cheap-looking. She didn't look like the queen of the cul-de-sac anymore. She looked like another homeowner, with too much pride and not enough water sense. "I will lose everything," she said. "House, job, reputation, even friends." I tilted my head. "You lost friends long before that creek," I replied. Her eyes closed. She knew. She always knew. But knowing something isn't the same as facing it. She opened her eyes again. "And you're going to watch me lose it all." Her voice cracked again, but this time it wasn't anger, just defeat. I stood still. Because she wasn't wrong, I was. But not because I wanted revenge, because I didn't stop nature, and I didn't protect her from her own choices. People think justice is loud, shouting, screaming, courtrooms, gavels. But sometimes, justice is just quiet and slow and impossible to control. The next weeks came like waves. Investigation trucks, city inspectors, engineers, environmental teams. They reopened every report, every denied complaint, every ignored warning. My name kept coming up, not as a suspect, but as a trail. The guy who warned, the guy who documented, the guy who followed every HOA rule perfectly and used them exactly as they were written. Some homeowners started thanking me, not loudly, not public, just in whispers, in texts, in quick handshakes at the grocery store. "You stood up without screaming." That was genius. They needed to learn. But some hated me because when disasters happen, survivors don't look for power, they look for targets. And I was still standing. Their houses weren't. A man from 3 doors down cornered me once near the mailbox. "You could have stopped this," he said, his voice shaking. "You knew." I looked at his flooded driveway, his ruined lawn, his broken porch, and said quietly, "I told everyone." He didn't answer, because deep down he knew too. He just liked her rules when they punished others, not him. That's the thing about compliance. It feels safe until it cuts both ways. The HOA board collapsed by the end of the month. Not officially. They were just too busy, fighting lawsuits, pointing fingers, protecting assets. They canceled meetings, stopped emails, even shut down the neighborhood website. It just died, like control always does. When you stop feeding it, Karen listed her house for sale, right next to the concrete creek, right next to the thing she forced into existence. No buyers came, even at half price, because nobody wants to live. On top of a mistake, I watched movers carry furniture from her place. Slow, quiet, embarrassed. She didn't come outside, not once, no goodbye, no wave, no speech, just gone. Her car disappeared. Early one morning, quiet like her apology, too late, too small, too soft. The city eventually broke through the concrete, reopened the creek.
Do not fall asleep during the office, as if monks needed the gentle reminder that God preferred them awake. After the midnight prayers, a small human intermission, after matins, monks sometimes returned to bed for a short second sleep. Other times they stayed awake, reading scripture by candlelight, or performing simple tasks in silence. But one of the strangest and most charming things monks did? They talked, quietly, softly, sleepily. It wasn't gossip. It wasn't storytelling, just small things that slipped out when the world was quiet. Reflections about the Psalms, little observations, shared burdens, even simple comments about the cold. These were moments outside the strict rule, unwritten but deeply human. Like the peaceful conversations you have with someone you trust during a long night. This gentle nighttime companionship helped monks stay grounded, proof that even in the strictest spiritual life, humans always find a way to be comfortingly human. Hermit nights, a different kind of silence. Far away from monasteries, hermits lived a separate nighttime world. Some lived in caves, some in tiny huts in forests, some near rivers, some in abandoned chapels or small stone cells built just for solitude. Their nights were quieter than quiet. No chanting, no bells, no footsteps in cold corridors. Just wind against stone, owls calling, frogs near streams, the crackle of a small fire and their own breath. Hermits embraced total silence, believing that in the stillness of night they could